I'd like to welcome everybody to the inaugural YouTube presentation for the Archdiocese of Chicago's Office of the Diaconate. We're envisioning perhaps monthly presentations on matters of interest to deacons, their life, their ministry, their work in the parishes and around the world. We're going to begin at the top. We're going to begin with the creme de la creme of speakers with our first effort here. We have Father Chuck Dahm, Order of Preachers, Dominican Father, who is here with us this morning to talk about domestic violence, the problems of what it is and how it might be addressed. So welcome, Father Chuck, and tell us who you are.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm a Dominican priest, and I've been in the Archdiocese of Chicago for about 40 years. And I was the pastor of St. Pius V Parish for about 21 years. And now I'm the director of domestic violence outreach for the Archdiocese. Okay.
Now, we'll want to add context and nuance to domestic violence. How do we address this? Do we say how big it is, or do we say what it is first? What's the best way of getting into this?
Well, I think it's important to know that it's very prevalent in the United States. It's almost an epidemic proportions, and most people don't know that. And I mean most people, including clergy. But the Center for Disease Control says that a woman is battered in this country every 3 seconds. And the center also says that 1 out of every 4 women at some point in her life will be hit or sexually assaulted by her partner. And that's astounding, 1 out of 4.
Right.
So we know it's very prevalent, very common, and it's in every community.
I was going to ask, is this confined to a socioeconomic strata, or is this?
No, there is this belief that it is, but the studies also show that domestic violence happens practically at the same rate in every community. So it makes no difference if you're African American or Hispanic or Caucasian or Asian or rich or poor, suburbs, city. It seems to happen in every community. And what I always say is, if you ask your local police what's the #1 most frequent 911 call they receive, they're almost always going to say domestic violence.
Is that right?
Because it is so common.
Now, is there, the numbers are shocking. Is there, I assume there's shame, there's guilt involved. Is there a suppression of those affected by it, suppressing, disclosing that to others?
Well, there's a lot of shame. There's many reasons why victims don't come forward, that's for sure. But what's important is that the more that we talk about it, the more we mention it, the more they will have confidence to come forward. That's my experience. So it's very important that clergy talk about it and preach about it and include it in their sermons, even though the sermon isn't about domestic violence, that they show that they recognize that this is a problem in the community, because it is a huge problem. But victims will not come forward, generally speaking, if they don't think the clergy is going to be understanding and responsive. So that's a major thing.
Now, how long have you been in this ministry?
Well, I was introduced to this ministry when I was pastor of St. Pius V. I hired a pastoral counselor, and one day she told me, Father, almost all my clients are women, and most of them are victims of domestic violence. And I had no idea. I knew many of those women, but I had no idea they were victims. So she had to open my eyes and teach me about how to recognize it and how to respond to it. And when I finished being pastor, I began preaching about it in other parishes. So I have preached at all weekend masses in 125 parishes in the Archdiocese.
200 to go or so.
I got 200 to go, right. And so I'm always willing to go to another parish, preach about it, and then form a local ministry in that parish.
Let me take a step back. We're talking about domestic violence. Is it, by that do you mean only physical assault, you mentioned sexual assault. How do you define domestic violence?
Domestic violence is defined very simply. It's any pattern of behavior that seeks power and control over another person. So it's a pattern of behavior, a way of operating that seeks power and control. And that power and control can be physical, it can be emotional or verbal, it can be economic or sexual. Mm-hmm. I mean, everybody understands physical violence, and most victims do. But verbal and emotional abuse is the most common form, but it's the most difficult to detect because there are no broken bones, no bruises. And many victims don't know what's happening to them with the verbal abuse. They just think, well, I live in a conflictual situation. Mm-hmm. But that can be very, very devastating. And many victims say it actually hurts more than physical abuse because it attacks the human spirit. And by that I'm referring to insults, foul words, excessive jealousy.
Belittling.
Exactly. Isolation from family and friends, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, we're typically thinking of male, female, husband, wife, people living together, that typically, correct me if I'm wrong, but typically the model there is male is aggressor and female is victim. But that's not always the case, is it?
No, definitely not. Men are also victims. And unfortunately, the studies are not very good to show us what percentage of victims are men. Mm-hmm. But the estimates are between 10 and 20%. Okay. So out of 10 victims, maybe 2 are men. The men are much more reticent to come forward, much more embarrassed. And there are very few services for men who are abused. Mm-hmm. There are some, but they're very limited because this all came out of the women's movement to help victims. So the emphasis, the money, the services, all focus pretty much on women. But men are also victims.
Have we thus far given a fair story for those who are watching as to what domestic violence might be, or could I ask, how do I know? How does it manifest itself if somebody doesn't tell me?
Well, I think what we have to, in the parishes, we have to be very sensitive when somebody comes and talks about their marital relationship mm-hmm. or their intimate partner relationship. They might not be married, but living together. And we have to ask questions. If we don't ask questions, we may not get the whole story. Mm-hmm. I will say this to priests. If you don't ask in the confessional, so why did you get angry at your husband, you'll never know mm-hmm. that there was maybe because he hit her, mm-hmm. okay? Mm-hmm. So you have to ask, does he hit you? Does he use bad words on you? Do you have your own money or access to money? Does he treat you with kindness and affection sexually? So you have to ask those questions. And if you don't, you may not get the story mm-hmm. because victims are generally reticent to share. But I found that when I do ask those questions, I do get a response. And then I can reflect back to the person, well, this is abusive behavior. You are really being abused. Mm-hmm. So it's important to help the person name what is happening to he or she. Mm.
So I suppose it's fair to say if this entire topic is just not on my radar as a minister, it's never going to occur to me to ask those questions. Yeah. And just, too bad you got angry, rather than taking it the next step.
In my experience working in the community in a parish, I became suspicious of almost every woman who came to see me about any kind of marital problems or almost anything. And I would ask, so how are you getting along with your spouse? And if she couldn't say very well, then I would say, well, so what's the problem? Mm. If she would just say, well, it's okay, it's like any marriage, we have a lot of problems. I would say, well, what are some of the problems? Mm-hmm. So I would investigate, mm-hmm. and I would ask these questions that were more specific.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there any other way that I, as a minister, am going to know about a particular individual's struggle with this? I mean, aside from the facial bruises or...
Well, one thing is that people could change their behavior. Mm-hmm. For example, they might all of a sudden not be taking care of themselves, mm-hmm. They might be being absent. They used to come all the time, now they don't come. They might be withdrawn, so before they were very participative, and now they don't say anything. So if you notice a change in demeanor, behavior, appearance, then it's worth asking some questions,
Sure.
obviously in private and separate. No, you never want to interview somebody who might be a victim together with their spouse.
Sure.
In fact, marriage counseling is definitely inappropriate for domestic violence. And that's, many priests and deacons don't know that, but people who are victims, who are going through this kind of abuse, need to have specialized counseling. And marriage counseling could actually be prejudicial because the two of them are there, and I just know that, it's commonly known that victims won't tell the whole story if the abuser is present. So you don't get to the bottom of it really with marriage counseling.
In talking about noticing what's going on with individuals, suggests to me the obvious response as a minister is that if I never spend any time with the people, if I'm always the guy up on the altar or what have you, or locked away in an office someplace, I'll be oblivious to that. I mean, that's pretty plain. But you're calling us to an involvement in people's lives.
That's right.
Otherwise, how would you ever know?
Yeah. Well, I think deacons are often involved with Eucharistic ministers, or lectors, or particular groups in the parish, and so they have to be very attentive to who the people are and what they're going through, because it's a very hidden kind of phenomenon. The abuse is definitely hidden, and many victims are there protecting their husbands. They don't want to let on because they don't want people to know they're living in this relationship, especially if the husband is active in the parish. They don't want to jeopardize his reputation in the parish, so they'll keep quiet.
Well, there's also the economic issue, and again, going back to my lawyering days, is that if he is the paycheck, if he is the breadwinner, it's tough to make ends meet if he is in the jail. You're trapped.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're trapped.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's very important too to understand, apart from not doing marriage counseling, is you have to recognize that we, and I include myself, are not really trained counselors.
Right.
So we're not there to counsel them. We're there to support them.
Let's repeat that for the benefit of our deacons.
Yeah. We are not counselors.
We are not counselors.
Yeah.
Right.
We are really the door to help people find counseling and services that are appropriate, which means professional help.
Right.
So, if a woman comes in, she's not even sure she is a victim, but I live in this situation, I think maybe it's a marriage problem, I would say, look for professional help, and they will help you think through this. They will help you decide whether it's abuse or whether it's just a marriage problem.
Now, what's that professional help look like?
Well, professional help generally means individual counseling, and we are very blessed in the Archdiocese of Chicago because we have many domestic violence agencies spread throughout the Archdiocese, and it's very easy to refer somebody. Every parish, every deacon should have at their fingertips the list of, and it's not a long list, but at least the one or two agencies that are relatively close to their parish, and they should be able to refer them.
Now, are these archdiocesan entities, or are these governmental or private sector?
No, these are non-for-profit, generally speaking. Catholic Charities does have services, but they're only in specific areas. But if you're on the north side, there are services. On the west side, there are services. Southwest side, northwest side, south side. There are agencies, and they're very reputable. They're non-for-profits, and they all provide services free. So people can find individual counseling, group support, and even referrals for legal assistance.
Okay, so we'll want to disseminate amongst the Chicago Diaconate that very chart of available resources.
That's right.
We'll do that. What else? You've got the microphone here. What else ought deacons and their wives know about this in terms of responding to domestic
Well, I
violence?
think one of the things that's important is to believe the victim. So victims generally do not exaggerate. They minimize. So like a woman might say, well, he pushed me. Well, if you say, well, what did that mean? I mean, he might have pushed her against the wall and she fell down and hit her head. But she may minimize it. So you have to believe what they say and don't doubt it. Don't think, well, she's just being hysterical. No. Victims do not generally exaggerate. Secondly, you don't want to go and talk to the abuser. Well, I'll talk to your husband. No, you don't.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, no, you don't want to do that. And now if she asks you to do that, that's okay.
Right.
And you should meet with him and say, but you have to get permission from her to bring up what she tells you.
Sure.
So, she's telling me that this is going on. What's going on? And he may deny it and so forth, but that puts her at risk. Okay. So she has to know that. If you want me to talk to him, he might come back at you. But she says, I'm not afraid of that. Don't worry about it. Would you like to? Well, then you could do that. Okay. So that's important. But I think looking for the professional help is one of the things. Now, on our website,
you have a website.
Yeah.
And what is?
Yeah. So it's embedded within the Archdiocesan website.
Okay.
It's under the Human Dignity and Solidarity part of the website. But if you just put in domesticviolenceoutreach.org and you put that in your browser, not in Google search, but in the browser, it comes immediately up. You go right to the spot in the Archdiocesan website.
Okay, so that'll have
and
these
that has a
resources.
list of all the agencies that are in Chicago that you can find assistance.
So we've got your willingness to come around to the parishes and
I'd be happy to go to any parish and give a talk. And also I should mention that we offer trainings, for parishes. And sometimes we group parishes together, like in a deanery. So this is generally speaking for parishioners, and maybe if you have a committee that's going to work on this, 3 to 4 hour training. But we also have an hour and a half training that we would offer staffs. And they would get a much fuller view of what domestic violence is and how to respond to it. Right. So they can easily contact us, and we've given them all over the diocese.
Well, this is
now, there is a much more profound training that is called the 40-hour training, which is state certified. And many of the agencies that provide services to victims, they provide a 40-hour training. So contacting them to enroll in that is another possibility. And you could become certified by the state as an advocate for victims.
Okay. Well, that's good. Father Chuck, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to do this and spreading this message.
You're welcome.
It's very important. As I mentioned at the outset, we're beginning this engagement, this series of shows. So I would love to have you come back again. We'll want to watch the tape and see how I did.
Okay.
But let's.
I would like to mention one more thing.
Go ahead.
Okay, and that is that the United States bishops have issued a pastoral letter. It actually was originally issued in 1992, and it's been re-edited or edited and reissued. In fact, this January was reissued. But it's basically the same. So you deacons can go and find this on the internet. Just put in "when I call for help." That's it. When I call for help, it comes up. It's not a long pastoral letter, but it is terrific. And it will tell you a lot about domestic violence and help you learn how to respond to victims. And one of the things that they say near the end of the letter is no one is expected to stay in an abusive marriage. And many people in the Catholic Church don't know that. So it's very important that message get out in all of our parishes. So, victims have to hear. And I always say, The bulletins, all church bulletins should have this. No one is expected, if stay in an abusive marriage, if you need help, call this number.
Well, on that score, maybe just as a final note, I found particularly refreshing. You'll see in parishes here and there little flyers about domestic violence.
Correct.
You'll see it in washrooms and throughout the church, so it's accessible. It's just
when I go to a parish and we form a committee, and we've got about 90 parishes that have committees working on domestic violence, we give them tips on how they can sensitize their parish so that victims, when they walk into that parish, they know this church, this community is against domestic violence. Yeah. And if you're experiencing any abuse in your relationship with your partner, your spouse, you can come to our parish and we'll help you.
Terrific, terrific. All right, Father Chuck, this is installment 1 of an ongoing conversation. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I think it's great.
Okay.
It works perfect.
Okay, I think we got it all in.
One little glitch on my side, but that's pretty easy to fix.
Well, we didn't know about it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, no.
So don't say anything.
Whacked out right at the last second. Everything else worked great.
Good.
So, awesome.
Well, thank you. This was wonderful.
That's good.
Let me know how it works out.
Yeah, we'll get you the link. I guess, in a week or so it'll be.
Yeah. Okay. I am working